Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Reality Bites, where we are exploring the ancient and mystical realms of Hermeticism with the 7 Hermetic Principles of reality as told in the Kybalion by Hermes Trismegistus. So, if you've been following along so far, we've covered the first 3 principles: the principle of mentalism, the principle of correspondence, and the principle of vibration. And hopefully, you've been noticing how these principles have been appearing in your world, being mindful of that. And maybe you've even ventured into reading the Kybalion. Well, if you have, then you'll definitely have a better understanding of these principles. And as I've said in previous episodes, I'm just touching the surface, just having a little wee peek into these principles so that hopefully you can explore them further in your own world. All right, so the last principle we talked about was vibration. So that was principle number 3. And number 4 is the principle of polarity. So in this 4th Hermetic principle, as stated in the Kybalion, everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites. Like and unlike are the same. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet. All truths are but half-truths. All paradoxes may be reconciled. So this whole notion of duality, which of course we've all experienced in our life. So you've got some examples: hot and cold, night and day, love and fear, up and down. There are so many of these examples in our world. So the 4th principle embodies the truth that everything has its pair of opposites. Everything has 2 poles, like north and south, or east and west. And everything exists in a state of duality. But the true nature of this principle is that opposites are the same, only varying in degree. So a really good example of that, which comes to mind, is of course a coin where you have heads and tails, seemingly 2 different sides that we may choose or think that are separate, but in fact are one and the same. So another simple example of this is hot and cold. And in Hermetic wisdom, they say that cold is just the absence of heat, and they're both one thing, temperature. I love that. Just it gives you a different take or a different viewpoint where we think one thing, like it's just cold, but it's actually the absence of heat. Anything that's cold, when you give it heat, becomes hot. And anything that is hot that cools off is, of course, cold. But it's one and the same thing. It's just a spectrum varying in degrees. And in the world right now, we can see that so much darkness is being exposed from the shadows. And it's the same with light and darkness. So light is just really the absence of darkness, or darkness is just the absence of light. And yeah, there's just so much darkness being exposed right now, which I would say is to do with the fact that as a humanity, as we're working and doing the inner work and awakening in our own lives, we're seeing the darkness come from the shadows. Or we're actually, a better way of looking at it is that as we are seeking the light within us, we're transmuting the darkness in the world, as within, so without. Remember, another principle from the Hermetics. So it's basically the opposing forces at play in the world right now are in fact identical in nature. It's one and the same thing. Remember, opposites are identical in nature, but in different degree. So think of love turning to hate. It's a really good example of that. And of course, another great example is the yin and yang symbol. They're both opposites of the same thing. Two things expressing different energies, but one and the same thing. And this whole idea of all paradoxes may be reconciled. It's interesting to explore that. But the Hermeticists say that the principle of polarity can be used as the foundation of alchemy, or the ability to transmute your experiences at will. So let's have a look at that. So the alchemical process of, say, turning lead into gold is analogous to transforming your inner wound or pain into wisdom or growth. I think that's really super important. So the ability through, say, mental stamina or will to shift your perspective or to take a lower vibrational state and transmute it to a higher state is, in effect, mental alchemy. So the principle is important to metaphysics because it suggests we can change this polarity of degree or spectrum of emotion by recognizing it as the same and choosing the degree which best suits our needs. So we can all become alchemists. So the practice of this art of mental alchemy, shifting your thoughts from negative to positive with intention, which so many self-improvement guides and books talk about, has, of course, always been a little bit of a conundrum, hasn't it? Because we're not always up and we're not always down. We're not always positive and happy and everything's in flow, because what comes up must come down, right? It is, whether we like it or not, duality exists in this universe. And I guess it's how we play that and how we navigate that. So by our very human experience and nature, then we're open to the full spectrum of thoughts, sensations, and experiences, which leads me to a little bit of a story I came across recently, which will hopefully sort of illustrate this whole idea of up and down, and that it's got to exist in this universe for a very important reason. So there's a story of a gentleman called Jeremy Pope, who was seeing his therapist, and he was talking to his therapist, and he was in a real low. And he said that he really wished he could control it. Now, of course you'd want to do this, right? If you're feeling low, depressed, it makes sense that you'd want to feel the opposite. He goes on to say, I hate that my highs are so low and the lows are so low. I just want to be in the middle. His therapist said you have to realize that if you're looking at a heart rate monitor, it's going up and down. And if you were in control and put it in the middle, you'd flatline. So we all know what that means. So you need to remember life is all about the highs and lows. And whenever you're in a high or low, life is telling you, or has told you, and will remind you, you will go to the opposite at any time. So I love that. I have this other favorite saying that the tide always comes back. So you have to have this trust and faith that if you're going through one of these spectrums, one of these extremes of polarity, whether you're in a real low, real funk, hit rock bottom, trust that the pendulum will swing back the other way. It's one of the universal laws or principles, of course. And indeed, the pendulum does swing back and forth. But if it rests, if it's no longer moving, then yeah, it's flatlined. So movement and flux or vibration is always a constant in the universe. Now, there is a case where there is non-duality. And I know that a lot of traditions and so many philosophies and wisdom traditions and teachings have talked about this non-dualistic nature, which is kind of like this oneness. That's really what our true nature is, this connectedness to the divine. And in order to transcend above duality, you will come to a place of samadhi. And in yoga traditions, this is regarded as the final stage at which there is union with the divine. So this, of course, is a very enlightened state. And what it's saying is that samadhi is where there is no longer a subject or object split, where your self, mind, body are all an entangled process with consciousness itself, with the universe, which of course is the first principle of the all is mind. So yeah, this idea of samadhi sounds very divine and very blissful. But the human experience, of course, in this so-called tangible physical form, as I've explained previously, is all about feeling and experiencing the full spectrum of emotions and sensations and experiences. So there you have it, a little bit of a bite-sized exploration into the fourth principle of polarity from the 7 Hermetic Principles of Reality. In our next edition in this series, we're going to explore the principle of rhythm. And just as a little teaser, the principle of rhythm states, everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. I like the sound of that. All right. Thanks again for joining me on this Reality Bites series, and I'd love to catch you in the next one. Bye for now.